Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining this podcast. My name is Dr. Irvin Scott, and I'd like to welcome you to Office Hours with Doc. Over the past 30 years, I, like many before me and many after, have devoted my life to America's children and its communities by working within the education ecosystem. In other words, I'm an educator. I've been a teacher. I've been a principal. I've been a district leader. I've been a nonprofit director. I've been a foundation executive. But so many before me have done those jobs, and so many people are doing those jobs, and so many people will do those jobs in the future. However, what we want to do in this podcast is look at individuals and listen to those individuals who are doing those jobs right now in order to do three things. One, we want to hear their stories, understand how they got to where they are, and what they're doing while they're there on behalf of America's children. And let's go beyond America, the world's children, because we have international perspectives that we'll be sharing. So that's the first thing. Number two, we want to better understand how these educators work within the ecosystem, not only as individual actors, because sometimes you have to do that, but more importantly, as team members to have impact. And then number three, speaking of impact, our goal is to hear how we might all work to accelerate our collective effort and impact going forward. These are the voices from the ecosystem that we'll hear in this podcast. If you've ever wondered what's going on in schools or school systems or school districts or however you think about schools in the US and the world and the lives of those individuals who are shaping children's lives, if you've ever wondered that, this is the podcast for you. Office Hours with Doc. Welcome. Wonderful. It is awesome to have my guest today. Welcome to Office Hours with Doc. I trust you've been enjoying these opportunities to just sit and talk to people who are doing the work in the field, in the pre-K-12 education ecosystem. I'm delighted to be back with you, and I'm delighted to have my guest, Mac Howison, with me. In a second, I'll have him introduce himself and talk about the work that he's doing. And we just have a couple of questions, in our office hours. We're not trying to make it a ton of time. We're trying to get some really powerful information in a relatively short period of time from the individuals who are doing the work in the field. And the key part of doing the work in the field is doing the work and not just talking to me. And so we want to give Mac an opportunity to share, and then get back to the part of the ecosystem that he's in. But let me first start off by welcoming you and welcoming Mac. Mac, it's great to see you. Thank you so much for joining us. And we'll jump in and we'll just ask you to just give us a little sense of who Mac Howison is. What's the work that you're doing? And we always ask our guests, how did you get to where you are? And then we'll take it from there. Great to have you, Mac.
Okay. Thanks, Dr. Scott. It's really it's a pleasure to be here with you today, having this conversation. I am currently located in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I work for an organization, private family philanthropy, called the Heinz Endowments. And I'm a Harvard Graduate School of Education candidate, finishing up my last semester in the online education leadership program. Dr. Scott, you were a big part of what interested me about that program. My cohort is we'll say the pilot or the pioneer cohort. We're the first. So it's been a great program, 2 years online, but very, very rich learning experience and an incredibly rich set of relationships that I've built, thanks in large part to the program design, Irvin, that you put together.
Thank you.
So yeah, what kind of brought me here? Just my quick background. I grew up in a family of educators. My mother was an art teacher and an entrepreneur. My dad was in higher education for his whole career. He ended it as retired from Washington and Lee University, was a dean of students there. So really surrounded by educators and the education ecosystem all the while growing up. Grew up in a small town in northern New York, and by the time Dad went to Lexington for Washington and Lee, I was on my way to college. So I went to public school my whole growing up. Then set out on my own in a way as an artist. I went to Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. That's what brought me to Pittsburgh. And that was for fine art, drawing and painting. And so coming out of that experience, I hadn't really planned I didn't plan very well to professionalize my arts career. So I did a number of different things. Probably most impactfully, which got me involved in education, was working as a museum educator at the Carnegie Museum of Art, and then doing some summer work as a historic interpreter at a lighthouse on the coast of Oregon. That's the Heceta Head Lighthouse. So just, in that informal space, that's kind of what brought me into direct contact with learners. After that, started a family early, got involved in cooperative economics and community organizing, and yet continued to come back to, the center of all of this really was continuing to come back to working in partnership with community. Those were, either adults working on activism issues, artists working in the public realm, as well as young people, eventually young people in more of the education ecosystem model, Dr. Scott, that you've talked about. So that was primarily eventually a longer term appointment that I had was with a grassroots organization called the Sprout Fund. We provided small grants to community organizations and to get new things off the ground. Some of that was arts, but a lot more of it was about engagement and the ecosystem idea. So building networks of support has always been really important to me. So eventually connecting young people, educators, administrators, both in formal and informal settings around Pittsburgh, positioned me eventually to go more directly into support for arts education, which is my focus area at the Heinz Endowments now. So that's the background.
That's right before you go to jumping into Heinz. I have to spend a few more minutes talking or having you talk a little bit about sort of your trajectory. I would describe it as eclectic, beautifully eclectic, right? So you start in New York, if I'm hearing you correctly. You go to Pittsburgh. You end up in Pittsburgh at was it Carnegie Mellon?
Carnegie Mellon.
Carnegie Mellon, which I typically think about as more sort of STEM focused, but you land there in the arts, which is fascinating to me. You eventually, at some point in time, go to Oregon, which is West Coast, and then come back East Coast. And then you've got this sort of beautiful intersection of the arts, community organizing. I even heard economics in there. It's just like this rich tapestry. Say a little more about how all of that sort of work together to enable you to land where you are, which I think is really, really intriguing, which is in a foundation, doing a lot of that work around the intersection of art, youth, community organizing. But just talk about that because we have a lot of people who are listening. They feel like I've been all over the place. Where do I land now? Go ahead.
Yeah. For sure. Being all over the place seemed to be, it was an accidental tourist kind of model for many years, Irvin. So I think what I began to realize over the course of that journey, essentially exiting undergrad, starting a family early, and really being in a circumstance where it was important to me to be able to support that family. I didn't feel like I had a whole lot of room for experimentation. And I didn't also have a whole lot of margin for error. I needed to be engaged and I needed to be gainfully employed too that whole time. So that was somewhat counterintuitive to where I thought I might be going as an artist. I thought I'd have a little bit more flexibility, a little bit more room to move. And that mandate, really, the importance of family and the importance of making sure that my children were well provided for, drove me to think about how do I do more with an orientation towards creativity, which was innate. It was something that I deeply love the playful process of creativity, but I was having trouble early on figuring out how to make that gainful, and also do something that was outside of myself, do something that was contributing to the community, and do something that was a little bit more full of giving and selflessness. And so that really took me from this kind of inward focus on the visual arts and music, and into thinking about what does the community need. And so while this is in hindsight too, I'm sort of doing this on the fly, but I did realize that what gave meaning and purpose to my life was to find forms of employment. One of those, after being on the West Coast and working with the Oregon Parks Department at the Lighthouse, was to return to Pittsburgh and get involved in the museum education culture. And that was an exposure to multidisciplinary learning. It was fundamentally working with young people who were there on informal time. These were not school groups. These were essentially after school clubs and weekend clubs that found a way to be exposed to fine art in the museum through outreach programs that actually tended to be in community centers, church basements, and we used a form of storytelling, usually reading books to young children that could then help them interpret the visual art that they saw when they came back to the museum. So that was a significant introduction to me to the intersection between community who may have less familiarity with something like fine art in a museum, but they are connected in the way that a story can help open up that pathway, that pathway to understanding, and that pathway to sort of visual learning. And so that was kind of a pilot. It didn't last forever. It was a part-time job, but it did help me think about what might my place be in an education ecosystem, what might my place in a community be that was more engaged with young people and the neighborhoods, young people, meeting them where they are. A lot of these kids were they're coming from very diverse neighborhoods, a lot of socioeconomic fragmentation, segregation. Pittsburgh is still a highly segregated place. And so making sure that young people had other ways of accessing institutions like a large museum that might not feel like it's for them. And then all this middle process then coming out of that, I was still in my early 20s. The middle process was actually doing community-based organizing and cooperative economics, both while working at a cooperative grocery and then eventually working at a nonprofit. That nonprofit was centered on providing resources. It was essentially an intermediary between the foundation community and emerging nonprofits, including individuals who just had great ideas. The Sprout Fund provided, that was kind of my training ground for essentially navigating resource allocation, resource distribution, negotiation between folks that typically did not have access to foundation resources and foundations who have a particular way of administrating and restricting their gifts. And that this was a training ground for many years to try to help people surface their ideas and then find the resources to do those. And fundamentally, I think what built up in me at that time and what I really found a lot of joy in contributing was the ability to make connections. The institution, the nonprofit, the Sprout Fund, we didn't have a ton of, it was not about the high number of dollars on the table, but it was more about you have a great idea. Here are some resources. What more do you need beyond the money to be able to really make a meaningful impact in the long term? So that's something, Dr. Scott, that's always resonated with me about your ecosystem model, and your
Mhm.
critical question is less about what is exactly is the job that you're doing, but more so what is the impact that you're looking to have. And that relationship connectivity, the ability for me to over time make more and more introductions fundamentally to other people, organizations, and networks that could be supportive beyond an award,
Mhm.
that really was the impact that meant the most to me.
That's great. So you've said so many different things. Several words that I would use to summarize it. One, when we talked about sort of the trajectory, you talk about your family, and the need to just do what families do, and that support one another, and your family is growing. I think that is a really important point. I just want to plant the seed for reminding our audience about my book, Leading with Heart and Soul. And one of the things that I try to sort of elevate in that book is that we don't do our professional work in isolation from our family and personal connections that make us who we are, our identities. And that it is that interweaving of that personal and professional that makes life rich, I believe, and makes us so much better at what we do professionally. So you plant the seed for that, right? The other thing you talk about is this notion of creativity still remain very important to you. The art still remain very important to you. So you're figuring out, how do I support my family while simultaneously being passionate about the thing that I feel like I'm on earth to do? And that is the arts, which is what you do when you sort of move to do your work. And then the third thing was this sort of community giving back. You talked about internal versus external. And I think that's something that's really important to educators. While we have internal stuff and we love these gifts that we have, at some point in time, we really become focused on external or simultaneously and trying to shape lives, shape community. And you're doing it now through a foundation. And so you're actually leading very nicely into this sort of second set of questions around impact. You talked a little bit about it when you talked about making these connections. Maybe you can say a word or two more about if someone were to ask you, Mac, what's the impact that you're trying to have? What's the impact that foundations can have? Just build on that a little more going forward. Because you're right, that is a key part of the education ecosystem. You start with impact, you don't start with just the job, is what I say to students.
Yeah. Well, that I appreciate that invitation, Dr. Scott. So I will then jump into um, that sort of exactly where I am now, what kind of impact I hope to make, and it picks up, the story then picks up from this community connectivity stage that
Mm,
where we just left off. So that Sprout Fund work, eventually led to an opportunity to join a much larger family foundation, a private family foundation called the Heinz Endowments. The Heinz family very involved in local civic activities for generations. Probably lots of folks on the call today are familiar with the Heinz name. Yes, in fact, the foundation did come from the pickles, the sauerkraut, and the ketchup. So we're and family members are still very involved in the direction of that foundation today. So it's an important it's a particular kind of role. It's a particularly unique position in the civic infrastructure to be part of a family foundation that's concentrated on the region. They really have dedicated their giving in Western Pennsylvania. Pittsburgh is the largest city in that area, but it is multiple counties, rural communities, actually quite a bit of the, we do talk about, and I think it's fairly accurate to think about Western Pennsylvania as a very American story. It has an American history, and it really represents a lot of what some of America's opportunities and challenges are today in terms of unity, division, agreement, disagreement, and potential tipping points towards, kind of getting stuck in place, or really having the opportunity to grow and change and pilot a new future for America. And we see that. I think the foundation thinks of the work that we do as being a microcosm of that. Of course, we're under no illusion that this is we can pull a lever in Western Pennsylvania and it changes all of America, but it is a place where we can make an impact. Given the scale of the resources that the Heinz Endowments has. Foundations have a unique role. Private foundations have a unique role. And I know you know this well, Dr. Scott. I think where I was most excited by the opportunity to be a part of the Heinz Endowments was an opening for being welcomed in as a new program officer and in a multi-purpose foundation. So the Heinz Endowments' big three focus areas on sustainability, which includes the environment, climate, health work, as well as civic engagement, and a focus on veterans, and a fairly large equitable community development portfolio under the sustainability umbrella. There's a learning area. Learning has primarily had a history of children, youth, and families support, kind of the human services side of things, as well as formal and informal education support. And then the longest running family investment that's represented at the Heinz Endowments is called creativity. That's essentially visual and performing arts.
That's where you are.
And well, so this is what's interesting. The opportunity for me was to be welcomed in as a new program officer to design a strategy that was the intersection of creativity and the learning area. So how does arts and creativity show up in young people's lives? What are some possible ways that arts and arts education, and commonly thought of as arts education, how can that vehicle, how can the partners who lead in that space make a bigger impact on young people's development? And what's the appropriate role for a foundation in that, when public education has particular structure around arts education, and there are a lot of institutions, especially at a place like Pittsburgh. You have museums, you have galleries, you have education outreach programs, neighborhood-based learning programs that center the arts. How does a foundation like the Heinz Endowments play a role in supporting that kind of a little bit of a nebulous ecosystem, really? And that's where a lot of your theoretical work, Dr. Scott, is applicable to what I was hoping to do at the Heinz Endowments, which was to develop a network-based or ecosystem way of thinking about how does arts, culture, and creativity show up for young people all over Western Pennsylvania, and what's our appropriate role to play when there are public, private, and other systems that push and pull on that. What was exciting about that impact opportunity was really to design something that took some legacy work in arts education, which was mostly school-based for arts specialists, and out of school time, a whole nother sector that has multiple ways that are supportive to young people, and be a lot more focused around what we mean by arts and creativity in that out of school time space.
Great. So a couple of things. One, say a little more. You're exactly right. I've spent some time in the foundation space, and I feel like they have a unique place in the education ecosystem. Say a little more about, relatively short. People might be listening and are like, program officer, what does that do? What does that person do? Say a little more about that. And then the other thing I'd love you to say a little more is the intersection with other parts of the ecosystem, which you alluded to, but just say explicitly a little more about who or what a part of the ecosystem you end up engaging with. But those two questions real quick.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a program officer at a family foundation. My work is primarily, I run grant making programs. So there's a portfolio budget that I have that are the foundation's resources that they are mandated to and choose to distribute to charitable organizations, 501c3 nonprofits. And so my work is the day-to-day relationship building for those nonprofits in the community to, as they propose their services, the foundation makes decisions about how we dedicate resources to those service proposals. And that's my fundamental job, is to essentially be I'm a middle manager that works on in between our board of trustees, the leadership at the foundation, and then the folks in the community running nonprofits that are requesting grants. So that's fundamental. Those are the mechanics of what I do.
Can I interject real quick with this question? Because I would imagine there are a lot of people out there. I don't know how many people are actually listening. I'm going to assume it's thousands upon thousands upon thousands, because I am a person who is very positive. So let's assume there are a lot of people out there, and some are nonprofit leaders who often try to figure out how to get their idea funded. Can we just take, if we gave you 60 seconds to give 3 pointers to individuals who end up in front of you or people like you, with ideas that they want funded? You're a program officer, you're part of making that decision. What 3 recommendations or 3 things you would encourage them to keep in mind?
Yeah.
And I know I'm putting you on the spot.
Yeah, no, it's great. And I hear the generalized request in that. So where I would, any nonprofit to be well positioned, I think for requesting a grant, you want to make sure your organization is in good working order. We want to have that be in a sense a foregone conclusion. Now we know that there's challenges. The nonprofit sector is always under different kinds of strain. So to the best of your ability, as a nonprofit requesting a grant, we want to make sure your finances, your organization, are in a healthy place, so that doesn't become a roadblock. The other, I think that is, I'll end, you said 3, so I'll end with the one that I think is the most important, actually. But the second one would be to understand, to the best of your ability, what the priorities of the foundation are. Make sure you're having the same conversation. So that I think is, there's a little bit of homework you can do before approaching a program officer. There's also, most program officers are very willing to have that dialogue before getting into the specifics, I think, of what you might actually be requesting. So are we talking about the same priorities? And the foundation is going to have a set of strategies and priorities. Those need to be in alignment. So researching alignment, I think, is an important piece. The last one, I think, for me, is the most exciting part of my job. You want to make sure when you're approaching a foundation that you got a solid idea, that you've got a really clear proposal, and it is, it matches those other 2 criteria. You got a strong organization, you know what the foundation is probably looking for. And the big exciting conversation is really, what exactly are you proposing, and can you get to it in a pretty concise way? And then again, that starts the best part of my job, which is getting to know you. There's a part B, there's like a 3A and 3B. 3B is, be willing to be told no. And I think that there are, you're going to find that that's going to happen more often than not. But the relationship with a program officer that comes out of potentially even a no, certainly maybe easier to feel like you're developing a positive relationship if you get told yes. But the no, and staying in relationship with that program officer, is a way to position your next ask for possible support.
That's beautiful. I didn't even give you a heads up on that. Great answer. You can tell you're a solid program officer. Great job. Appreciate that. Listen, as we come to a close, there's this question that I think you were getting ready to get into, which has to do with your partners, where you are in the ecosystem. The whole idea behind the pre-K-12 education ecosystem is that the ecosystem doesn't always work together well. So talk a little bit about how you do your work through others. Who are some of those key partners? ways that it can be improved. Just your perspective on that, and we'll wrap it up. This has been phenomenal.
Thanks so much, Dr. Scott. And I love the ecosystem model for a variety of different reasons. And applying it, I think, in the education space is really is very accurate and healthy. So, a foundation really is on that kind of investor side, supporter side. Yet, I think that foundations also must because I think we don't do foundations. If you look at them in isolation, foundations very rarely operate anything. We're looking for the good ideas. We're looking for the organizations that help us advance our strategies because you're representing the organization that actually does the work. So we really rely on this ecosystem and its many different parts to actually help the family, in this case, advance the issues that they care about by resourcing them. So that, it's really reaching across the system. So the PK-12 system, the districts, the agencies, the direct folks that work directly with young people and providers, and that includes teachers, administrators, the whole architecture at the center of the system. We know that that's essential, and that's where the most kids are. And not every foundation is supporting work directly in districts, but we know that those represent the places where young people and their families are most accessible and most likely to be located. Around that, though, I think you're going to find that foundation work really touches a reliance on the policy and advocacy organizations, where it's critically important a lot of times for foundations to influence policy, yet we must do it through partnerships.
Yeah.
We aren't doing that work directly. There is a part of the tax code that prohibits a foundation from doing direct lobbying, but we can support advocates, and those advocates can then take policy to state houses and to the and where there might really be some change. And we are typically in pretty close partnership with those organizations. Technical assistance and provider organizations, that's a key connection too. So we may provide support for an organization to do the core of their work, but if they need some support to do the core of their work better, then we might also have the resources to be able to engage that technical support. We rely a lot on research and evaluation, a lot of foundation work. And Dr. Scott, I'm sure you're familiar with, I've read the work that you did at Gates. That's substantiated and proliferated, not just by the foundation making the resources, but by commissioned research and evaluation that then makes its way into the field that hopefully then influences work in the ecosystem. So we're in dialogue. And lastly, I think, the other oval here around businesses and corporations, that is usually local, at least in the terms of the Heinz Endowments. Those would be critical local civic stakeholders that have to, they're driving the workforce. They're building the tax base in a locale. And we have to complement that work. We need to be in conversation. On the third leg of that stool, usually then is some kind of municipal agency, a local government, a county government, state government. And the three of those working together, private foundations have this really kind of unique wedge. We can often say the things that neither the corporate sector nor the government sector are either able or willing to say. We have a particular insulation from risk because a foundation like the endowments, that's exactly what we are. We're an endowment. We're a financial engine in perpetuity. We don't have the same kind of public stake that a municipal agency would or elected officials do. And we don't have the same kind of economic stake that businesses and corporations do. So there is that unique role, and we become a part of the ecosystem in that way.
Oh boy, that's a brilliant overview. And I'm not just saying that. You said something about the research and evaluation portion, which I think was so on point. You use the word substantiated, um, and I forget the other word, but it had to do with spread. It had to do with if you're doing work, one of the ways that people can gain confidence in that work is if you have some evidence behind it, if you can show that it's had an impact. And if you can show that it's had an impact, then it's much more likely that people will want to pick it up and spread it. And so I thought that was a really just all solid points around how the ecosystem works together, or unfortunately, sometimes doesn't work together. The last thing I'll say is I'm so excited about having you, and we'll have other foundation people in the future. Because one of the things that I learned when I was at the Gates Foundation is that I think foundations play a particularly unique role in that, and you sort of alluded to it when you talked about the difference between foundations and corporations and sort of this notion of protection, whatever, in that foundations often can find ways to incentivize the ecosystem to work together, to be coherent. And those incentives sometimes come through actually monetary grants or whatever the case may be. But sometimes it's just the fact that the foundation sort of sits at the center and kind of brings people together if it leverages its influence, its power, unique sort of characteristics that these other entities like corporations, schools, and even policy individuals can't necessarily be in that role. So really, really nice description, Mac. This has been a fascinating, powerful conversation. If I were to ask you what's one word or two that you would like to leave our audience with around the power of your work, and why you do what you do, sort of on a internal personal level, um, how would you like to leave us?
Thank you. There's more than one word, so I will choose one, um, which is I'll choose two. So it's collaboration and community.
Mm, beautiful. Collaboration and community, that is ultimately what we're trying to figure out how to do in the pre-K-12 education ecosystem. For what reason? So that we can impact lives, impact millions of students across the country, in Pittsburgh and beyond. And we just thank Mac Howison for joining us. Thank you, my friend.
Thank you, Dr. Scott.